Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining me here today. My name is General Confusion, and this is Total War Warhammer 2. Specifically, this is my wrap-up video on the Skaven. I've played a whole bunch of battles as the Skaven. I've played about 30 hours of the game all told, and almost all of it has been Skaven. In campaign, Quick Head Taker, and in multiplayer, I've played a couple dozen Skaven multiplayer matches, several against each of the other three factions. I feel like I have a pretty good handle on how the Skaven function, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. There are a couple of units in the roster that I haven't covered in videos that I've recorded, so I'm going to go over them really quickly. Generally, I haven't covered them because they're bad, or at least not as good as the others. Stormvermin Sword and Shield. Stormvermin Sword and Shield suffer from Generalist Syndrome, and the Skaven hate Generalists, basically. Stormvermin Sword and Shield are an elite Sword and Shield infantry. That's a type of unit that none of the other three factions actually have, and only one other faction in Warhammer 1 had, Chaos. And that's because basically it's a bad unit type. Elite infantry without armor piercing suffers against other elite infantry, and so the only real good targets for them are cheap infantry. But there are other, more efficient ways to deal with cheap infantry that don't involve spending over 1,000 points on a single unit. So Stormvermin Sword and Shield, let's say they're niche. They don't really have a good, solid place. Other than that, I went over Deathglobe Bombardiers very briefly. They made one appearance. I used them badly, and so they didn't show off their abilities. They're actually very powerful. A unit of Deathglobe Bombardiers can smash any infantry unit in the game in maybe 3 volleys. The trick is just keeping them alive long enough to get those volleys, because they are very fragile, and they're scary, so the enemy will tend to target them. Flying units, monsters, cavalry, all come straight for the Deathglobe Bombardiers. So you've got to protect them carefully. If you do, they're worth their weight in gold. I had these guys get more than 200 kills in a battle against Dark Elves. They destroyed 3 units basically on their own while they were being held down by clan rats. Hellpit Abominations suck. There's no kind way to say it. They have a whole lot of hit points. They have regeneration. They have this too horrible to die ability, but it sucks because it only gains about 1,000, I think like 1,200 hit points, something like that. And it's a 50% chance to just die as soon as they drop below about 1,000 HP. So it's not worth it. There's a 50% chance that your hit points go up by about 1,200, or from 900 hit points, 907 hit points, you just keel over and die. And when they die, they spawn Skaven Slave Spears, which isn't worth mentioning. Skaven Slave Spears cost 150 because they're terrible. The spears spawn from the Hellpit Abomination will not accomplish anything, and they'll break almost instantly. Then in terms of raw stats, the Hellpit Abomination is just bad. Low melee attack, low melee defense. Its bonus versus large is nothing to write home about. Its charge bonus is low. Its armor is low. The only thing that's exceptional about it is leadership, and that's really not worth it. Plus, it's weak to fire damage, so it causes terror, I guess. It has some missile resistance. It's not worth 1,800 points. It needs a buff desperately. In general, so those are the units that I hadn't talked about. I also didn't show off Plague Claw Catapults, actually, and it's not because they're bad. It's just because they're overshadowed in the category. Plague Claw Catapults are perfectly solid for 900 points. You get a lot for what you're paying. You get a very good catapult that contaminates the enemies that it hits and does a whole bunch of damage and has magical attacks and all of this stuff. They're good. It's just that Warp Lightning Cannons are so much better. Warp Lightning Cannons, assuming you can get a good shot, because Warp Lightning Cannons are a little terrain dependent. You have to place them carefully for that flat trajectory to get to what you're shooting at. If you can do that, though, Warp Lightning Cannons do more damage against literally every kind of target. Elite infantry, crap infantry, other artillery, cavalry, monsters, lords, heroes. Warp Lightning Cannons do better. They're more accurate, and they do more damage per shot. Doom Wheels, of course, are also fantastic. So in this category, the point competition is skewed away from Plague Claws. The only place where they really shine is when you're playing against other Skaven and you need the extra splash damage. But that's enough of specific units. In general, the Skaven are a very counterpick dependent faction. The Skaven basically have good units in every category, except for cavalry, but they even have Rat Ogres, which are kind of like cavalry. They're slow for cavalry, but they do the job. The Skaven have strong lords overall. They have very strong heroes. The assassin is fantastic at defending your lords and attacking enemy lords in the middle of the melee. The plague priest, especially when on the plague furnace, is also great. He can cast plague spells, which are great. He has decent melee stats. He discourages the enemy. He has a big bonus versus infantry. And on the plague furnace, he acts as a mortis engine. He strips hit points off of enemy units nearby. So with that 100 armor, high HP, and decent melee stats, you can just jam the plague furnace right into the middle of the army and have it go nuts. The warlock engineer on his own hawk is not great, but the warlock engineer gives you the opportunity to take Howling Warp Gale and Warp Lightning really, really cheap. And Howling Warp Gale and Warp Lightning are such good spells that if you don't take them on your lord, I think you're almost obligated to take a less than 600 point Warlock Engineer just in order to get access to them. Warp Lightning, fantastic damage, short cooldown, low cost. Howling Warp Gale, excellent utility. It's Net of Ammontok for flyers. It lets you stop the single most threatening thing the enemy can bring, which is terror-causing flying units, and trap them in midair so they can be shot by your Warp Lightning cannons and Poison Wind Globadiers and Gutter Runners with poison. Gutter Runners with poison, there they are. So, I always want this spell, especially because it's so cheap. I always want this spell, I usually want this spell. Sometimes I want this spell. I rarely want this spell. It's so expensive and it's just hard to use effectively. Not that it can't be very effective, but my micro isn't that good. Scorch, Death Frenzy, If you overcast it, it's area of effect, which is pretty cool, but overall, not worth a whole lot. Pestilent Breath, good, A+. Blessed with Filth, solid utility, nothing special. Wither, fantastic, when combined with ranged units especially. Overcast it takes off 60 armor for almost a minute. Elite enemy infantry melt when you cast this spell on the front line. Vermintide, bugged, so I haven't used it. Lots of solid utility, but I'm not using it until it gets fixed. Same for Pestilent Birth. Lots of solid utility, not using it until it gets fixed. This one actually could be devastating. Once it gets fixed and I start using it, it's totally worth 209 points. Plague, situational. You need to have a big blob of infantry in order for it to be worthwhile, but it causes magical damage, so yeah, it's good. It's just that you need a very specific situation for it to be worth its cost and its cooldown. So, that's the magic. Those are the heroes. Lords, the Warlord is basically your budget option. Put him on a Bonebreaker, take the World's Edge armor to get a whole bunch of extra protection for a minute, put him in with a pack of Rat Ogres, and he'll do fine. Running around the battlefield causing chaos, you do kind of have to watch him, because when he doesn't have World's Edge armor up, his armor is kind of low. You can also give him the Shield of Distraction to make everybody else hit him a little bit less. That's worthwhile. The Greyseers, Greyseer of Plague, interestingly, does not have Pestilent Birth. So, that's weird, personally. I think it's weird. But, Greyseer of Plague, pretty solid choice. I would probably rather take a Plague Priest on a Plague Furnace if I wanted Lore of Plague. I think the Greyseer of Ruin is the single best Lord choice, especially on the Screaming Bell. Now, that's only true for right now. I'll talk about what Mortal Empires will do to that choice a little bit later, but in the current metagame with these four factions, the Greyseer of Ruin on the Bell is fantastic. He gets the Ruin lore, which is great. You can even bring the Dreaded 13th once it gets fixed again. If you like the Dreaded 13th, it causes a whole bunch of damage and spawns a free 1,000-point unit, so totally worth it. He can take the Warpstorm Scroll to extra screw flyers, because Skaven hate flyers. And he has Arcane Conduit, so he can cast a whole bunch of spells. This guy's very solid. Lord Skrolk, decent, tends to die, but tends to take a lot of stuff with him, which is great. Queek Head Taker, fantastic duelist because he has Trophy Heads. And Dwarf Gouger. Trophy Heads and Dwarf Gouger combined make him murderously effective against enemy lords. I'll be honest, if you take Queek with Trophy Heads and Dwarf Gouger, I'm not sure if Grimgor would beat him. That would be an interesting fight, to say the least. But in general, I don't think Queek is really worth it, because he's just another melee fighter. If you want a melee fighter, take a Warlord. I think the spells are the interesting part, because Skaven both the Lore of Ruin and the Lore of Plague are quite strong. Even without the summoning spells, Plague is still quite strong because of Wither and Pestilent Breath. And Ruin is strong because of Warp Lightning, Howling Warp Gale, and Crack's Call, which is a little bit more situational, but still very powerful. Infantry-wise, Skaven have infantry that runs the gamut from terrible meat shields to causes a huge amount of damage and lasts forever. Stormvermin Sword and Shield, not really worth it. I would probably go with Stormvermin Halberds instead. They have cool special abilities like the Death Runners that have the Weeping Blade, and the Censer Bearers that have the -10 leadership plus the armor piercing and magical attacks. And then of course you have the Clan Rats, which are just a sturdier breed of fodder. I like Clan Rat Spears because they can do a little bit of damage to large creatures with that bonus versus large. Clan Rats with shields, really their only virtue is that they're a little bit cheaper, but for 25 gold, I'd take the Clan Rat Spears every time. Missile infantry and artillery are really where the Skaven shine. The infantry mainly exist to support them. Gutter Runners with poison, of course, we've talked about a lot. Poison Wind Globadiers are fantastic answers against monsters. Warp Fire Throwers are actually awful in multiplayer. They're just too fragile. Armor 40, too low to defend them, no shields, 2300 hit points. They die, they die, they die, they die again. They never get a chance to fire much. They never get enough kills to pay for themselves. I really want them to be worthwhile because they're so cool, but they're not. You have to get really lucky in order to use them effectively, and it's very, very sad. Slingers, I didn't use slingers much. I experimented with them some. The poison slingers are pretty decent because they can apply poison from quite a ways away. Night Runner slingers I would stay away from because they just don't have anything special about them. They're cheap, but if I wanted to pay that little, I would take the Night Runners. Actually, I would take 2 Skaven Slave Slingers and something else. Or I would use the 100 gold to put chevrons on something. Skaven Slave Slingers are actually pretty good. In particular, this is hilarious, because this many Skaven Slave Slingers happens to be exactly the cost of a Hargoneth Executioner, and in combination with Overcast Wither, they will destroy that Hargoneth Executioner in like 2 volleys. It's absurd. And it makes Dark Elf players rage quit. Monster-wise, Rat Ogres, pretty solid. Don't use them as monstrous infantry, use them as cavalry. This is your flanking force, not your infantry support force, because in the infantry fight, they will die. They have low armor, their hit points are not great, their leadership isn't fantastic. What they need to do is charge, rout a unit, get out, charge again. They're shock cavalry. In particular, with Frenzy, they have a charge bonus of 50, which is not bad, and which boosts their melee attack to reasonable levels when they charge in. Artillery we've talked about. Warp Lightning Cannons are fantastic. The only problem they have is that they have to have clear line of sight and straight line of sight. They're very tall, so they can shoot over pretty much any unit in the game. But terrain is their enemy. The Doom Wheel is so solid, so amazingly solid. I would take a Doom Wheel, or maybe 2 Doom Wheels in almost every Skaven army, because it just does so well. It has high armor, it's fast, it has a huge bonus versus infantry, it has a good charge bonus, it has this ranged attack with the lightning, so that even if it's not in melee, it can run around causing damage to everything near it. It causes terror. I love Doom Wheels. I would marry a Doom Wheel if I had the opportunity. They are so good. They're so good they may well be nerfed. And I will be so sad if that happens, because I love them. So, when it comes to Skaven, you have some core units. Assassins are a core unit because of their abilities and the way they can stop the enemy from sniping your lord, and they can debuff a whole front line. 2 assassins dropping Rival Hide Talisman basically means the enemy front line sucks for the next 30 seconds, no matter what they are. No matter what unit he brought, they suck now. They just don't do damage. Plague Priests, good, but not core. Warlock Engineers, good, but not core, unless you didn't bring the Greyseer of Ruin, in which case you really want one, because you really want Howling Warp Gale and Warp Lightning. I mean, what else can I say? The core Skaven units are Assassins, Skaven Slaves and Skaven Slave Spears, Clan Rat Spears with shields, Plague Monks, Stormvermin Halberds more situational, Gutter Runners with poison, Poison Wind Globadiers, Warp Lightning Cannons, and Doom Wheels. These are the pieces that build a strong Skaven army, a strong generalist Skaven army. To these units, you then add specialty units depending on your matchup. So if you're going up against Dark Elves and you expect a lot of heavily armored elite infantry, or High Elves for that matter, you take some Death Runners. If you're going up against Lizardmen and you expect a whole lot of monsters, you take some extra Poison Wind Globadiers. If you're going up against High Elves and you expect cavalry, you take a couple of Rat Ogres. If you're going up against anyone, you take another Doom Wheel. And another Doom Wheel, and another Doom Wheel, and another Doom Wheel. If you want to be really cheesy, you can make an army out of Doom Wheels. It actually works. They can be spammed. It's hilarious. In general, you want a Grey Seer. You can take Queek. You can take a Warlord if you have some Rat Ogres. Warlords on Bonebreakers work well in Rat Ogre packs with the Shield of Distraction and the World's Edge armor. They work pretty well, but I like the Grey Seer better. But so, this is how Skaven work. You have the basic kind of core of the army. You know, you have some infantry meat shields, you have some skirmishers, you have an artillery piece, and then you put in blocks of other troops depending on what you're fighting. And there are variant strategies. For example, you can do a Plague Monk Death Runner front line, because the Death Runners debuff armor and the Plague Monks do a lot of non-armor piercing damage, so that can be terrifying. You can take a very heavy anti-large front line with a couple of Storm Vermin Halberds and a bunch of Clan Rat Spears with shields, and then like 1 or 2 Plague Monks. That can definitely work out well against the Lizardmen, for example. But in general, what you're going to do is you're going to build disposable infantry, gutter runners, or whatever other skirmisher you like, maybe a Poison Wind Globadier or a Death Globe Bombardier, and a Warp Lightning Cannon, and a Doom Wheel. I think those are really important parts of any Skaven army. And then you're just going to fill in whatever it is else that you want. Because Skaven can do anything. That's the beauty of this army. Skaven can go full Monster Mash. I could even take some Hellpits. They're not that bad, they're just not efficient. But I could do this army. What else could I put in there? I could put in 2 Doom Wheels with this army. That's a viable army in some situations. The Skaven can do pretty much anything. The risk you run with the Skaven is, if you take the wrong counters, your enemy will run right over you, because your units are individually fragile. The Death Runners, for example, an elite infantry by price, but not by leadership and not by armor. They do have this physical resistance, it just means magical attacks destroy them, while they hold up surprisingly well against physical attacks. But, your Clan Rats, leadership 45, they'll rout. Your Plague Monks, armor 10, physical resistance 15, they'll just die. Plague Monk Sensor Bearers, they'll die. Your specialist units are typically relatively weak. Gutter Runners are kind of an exception. They're relatively strong, but even so, they're not quite as strong as infantry. Your Poison Wind Globadiers have high armor but low health, so they're vulnerable. So this is the theme. The Skaven have powerful tools against anything anyone else can bring. But their tools are fragile, and so they have to be used carefully. The Skaven are a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, in most circumstances. Currently, out of the 4 races in Warhammer 2, I would rate Skaven as number 1, or maybe tied for number 1 with the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves also have a lot of tools. Ironically, the Dark Elves have a very bad matchup against the Skaven, I think. I don't lose against Dark Elves, typically speaking. I've lost against High Elves once, and I lost to a friend once when we were kind of just screwing around. That's it. So, but when Mortal Empires comes out, the meta is going to change. In particular, I mentioned that I was going to talk about how this might not be a good idea in Mortal Empires. Having a big, slow chariot as a lord target like this might not work so well against Imperial Grand Cannons or Dwarf Cannons or any of that. So, or Bretonnian flying circuses even, so that might definitely change. Skaven are going to move around in the meta a lot when Mortal Empires comes out, because, as I said, they rely so heavily on counterpicking. You have to have the right tools in your toolbox, in the infantry you take, or the enemy army will just run right over you. If the enemy goes cav or monster heavy, and you don't have a couple of Poison Wind Globadiers, you're in for a bad day. If the enemy goes very, very infantry heavy and you don't have Plague Monks and maybe even Death Runners, you're in for a bad day. So, Skaven Skaven require a little more finesse. There's no such thing as an all-comers Skaven army build, I don't think. I don't believe. With the Empire, you could build a pretty decent all-comers list. With the Greenskins, you could build an okay all-comers list. With the Vampire Counts, you could build a pretty good all-comers list. I don't think you can really do it with the Skaven. So, that's how I feel about the Skaven. They're my favorite faction so far. I love them. Analytically speaking, I think they're terribly, terribly interesting. Strategically speaking, they're very interesting. They have so many options at so many different price points. You can really mix it up with the Skaven, and I love that. I'm going to keep playing them for a long, long time. But in the next week, I'm going to be moving on to the Lizardmen, which are a very different challenge because they have very different Lord and Hero type options, and their options in terms of infantry and skirmishers quite limited, but they have a ton of monsters, so the Lizardmen are all about the monster mash, and next week we'll be seeing how well that plays out against the other factions. So, thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate your attention. I love doing this, and I hope that you all love listening to it and watching it. And I hope that it's useful. I hope that you're getting a few insights. You can get kind of a discussion started about all this stuff. So, thank you all once again, and I will see you next time when I start the Lizardman coverage. Have a good one.